Too, and I meant tornado, of course. Did I say tornado? After torpedo?
Had you grown up in Worcester?
No, I had not. I grew up in the South Shore of Massachusetts.
What made you come to Worcester?
Dr. John Fallon.
Okay.
Dr. Fallon was a very good friend of a mentor of mine in medical school, Dr. Harold Weatherford, who was a histologist, and put me in touch with Dr. John. And as a result, I never applied anywhere else. I came up to see Dr. Fallon, and he convinced me that this was the thing to do. So here I am.
Okay.
And when I had finished my military service, I wrote, Dr. Fallon by that time had died, and his successor was Dr. John Myers. And I wrote to Dr. John Myers asking him about the Worcester scene. And his answer, his reply, was to send me an appointment to the staff at St. Vincent. And at that time, one did not receive bonuses for signing up at hospitals. One sought after hospital appointments. And this was a very significant happening. And while I'd looked around the country, had even considered staying in Tokyo, as a matter of fact, when I had that appointment, I thought, my goodness, this must be a sign.
Yeah.
So we came here.
Had you expected to get a hospital appointment that early in your career?
Oh, I had hoped that I would, yes. I can't say that I had any expectations that I had anything special to offer to any hospital, except that I was boarded in pediatrics and had a fair amount of pediatric experience in the world's largest HMO, the United States Army, and thought that this was a good thing to do.
Okay. So going back to when you started in Worcester, you said you took care of mostly newborns.
Took care of mostly newborns and well children in the office. At that time, sick children were seen almost exclusively at home. Okay. And the office practice would be conducted mostly in the afternoon when we do hospital rounds and make house calls in the morning, go to the office and see one's patients there, and then after hopefully getting home for dinner, see one's wife and children. One would then go make some more house calls and maybe a second series of rounds.
So how long was a day for you then?
Day began at 7:30 with a worried mother's call hour. I had a telephone devoted to my professional activities, and between 7:30 and 8, mothers, fathers who wished to speak with me, make arrangements for a house call or for an office visit would call at that time, and I would speak with them, and then it was a great time saver for them as well as for me. Then after that, I would, as I indicated, go and make hospital rounds and house calls, and probably, depending upon the season, pretty much be home by 8:30, 9 o'clock at night.
What was the most difficult thing for you when you first started here in Worcester?
My goodness, nostalgia is the art of remembering things that never happened. I think perhaps the constant being on call, and I was in solo practice, so that except for an occasional afternoon or an occasional evening, once in a great while a weekend, one was at the beck and call of one's patients, and it was, in many ways, it was very satisfying to be needed to that extent. But at the same time, it was constant pressure.
What was that like for your family?
My family were very understanding about this, very supportive, and were great.
Did you ever get any vacations?
After I'd been in practice for, I believe, about 15 months, I took an evening off. After I'd been in practice for, I believe it was for 2 years, I took a week's vacation. I then began to, then I brought on a partner, and that made it possible for each of us to alternate weekends and alternate vacation times. So life was much easier.
So when you were making your house calls, what was a typical house call like, and what was it typically for?
Generally speaking, it would be for gastroenteritis, upper respiratory infection, occasionally a surgical abdomen, sometimes some trauma. By and large, infectious disease.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Did that change over the time you were in practice?
Sure.
How so?
Well, we had immunizations, so that we had access to increasing access to antibiotics, and I think also there was a significant degree of patient awareness in terms of preventive medicine. The major thing that came along was the removal of the financial barrier to care by virtue of the development of HMOs. People who would be concerned because their child had abdominal pain, but knew that it was going to be expensive to have that child looked at, would put off the visit, the call, and it was not uncommon to see a ruptured appendix because of that delay in treatment. That has now changed because people now, by and large, are able to have access to care without the financial barrier in most instances, not altogether as yet, but that will come.
When did it start to change?
It started to change during the 70s. That was when the first health maintenance organization opened in Worcester, 1977.
And which one was that?
Fallon Community Health Plan. Right.
What was your involvement with that?
I was on the board of directors of the plan from the beginning. Subsequently served as the president of the health plan.
When you were developing the health plan, what did you use to help you develop it, or what models did you look at?
We had a great deal of assistance from the Harvard Community Health Plan, which was then Harvard, not Harvard Pilgrim, and we were supported in great measure by Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. To their everlasting credit that they stood behind us and gave us some help in kind. We gave them seats on the board for some time, and that was generally the model that we used. We also relied upon the American Group Practice Association because, as you know, it was the found clinic or the founding organization of the health plan. I should ask you what you've heard about health plans.
What we've heard about health plans is mostly the barriers to care that they set up. I think now that there's such a different view of the bureaucracy that has gone into them. I know this past year we've heard about like the tremendous amount of overhead inherent in health plans.
Some. Right.
How do you think they've changed since they've come into being?
I think they've become much more sophisticated. I think they're relying more upon some good data with respect to separating the patient's needs from the patient's wants. Difficult to do. Difficult to persuade the patient that the patient's needs and wants are diametrically opposed sometimes. And difficult to convince people that, like all of us, they have some responsibility with respect to the rising cost of health care. It's difficult for them when it's you who has the illness to take that into consideration. So it's a question of not waiting until the illness occurs, but have an ongoing educational process. And I think that's been significant. I think many people, when they're well, realize that, but it's more difficult for them to accept it when they're ill or when a member of their family is ill. But I think there's no doubt in what I've seen personally, individually, is that the patient today is getting immeasurably better care than was when I started practice 40 years ago. And I think it's primarily the result of removing financial barrier to care and also being able to define what quality of care is. It's enough speech on managed care. But you know where I'm coming from, don't you?
Yep.
You won't hear that very often.
No.
No. You particularly will not hear it in academia.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
We absolutely don't.
You read the New England Journal of Medicine?
I haven't.
I get it. I look through it occasionally, but I can't say that.
Well, sure, we all do it occasionally, but there's oftentimes some very good articles. And I wish I could remember the op-ed article that appeared, I think it was probably sometime in April, written by a physician at Columbia, who really defined what professionalism is all about in terms of managed care and all of the challenges that are present today. And the only thing I can say to you in terms of coming along as you will, get yourself involved. Don't let everybody else take care of it. Don't be just the clinician. Okay? Be the citizen too. The little pro.
I think that's really important.
And it sure is.
I think
Sure.
probably in every science, get practitioners of the science involved in the community.
Right. Yep. Yep. Remember the expression, the only thing that needs to happen to have disasters happen is for good people to do nothing.
Yeah.
Who said that?
I have no idea.
I can't remember either.
Did you find when these managed care plans were first developing that physicians didn't have as much input as they do now? And that adversely affected the way?
Oh, I think that when it was first developed, it was developed primarily by physicians, and I think they had a significant amount of input. As the plans have grown, it's become necessary to call on other, and well, we might call on other specialists, if you will, non-physician specialists, to help us with some of the things like marketing, like quality of care. So a lot of people outside medicine know a great deal.
I did a lot of physicians talking that didn't have as much input, and people who made the policy decisions are executives as opposed to
Yeah.
physicians.
Well, that's the rote of the New England Journal of Medicine and of the Journal of Pediatrics and so forth, so on. So examine it yourselves and see.
When it was being developed, and it was developed by physicians, what were some of the things that prompted the Fallon Health Plan to be developed?
I think seeing what was happening in the country, I think we were impressed by what Harvard was doing, the Community Health Plan. As you know, it was started by the Harvard faculty, by Dean Ebert, and he was a prime mover in this. And I think we saw that example and thought that was good. And there was also a certain sense of oughtness, that we were impressed with the fact that people were not getting access to care, that there was a significant financial barrier. And not to make us sound like goody two-shoes, but we felt that it was incumbent upon us to address that. And we also felt that the competitive nature of medicine and physicians, competitive, you know that for goodness sake. You start competing as soon as you get into college to get into medical school. Compete for the first place in the class, compete for the good residency. I think we were looking for our own self-interest in terms of what we saw coming down the road. So it was a little bit maybe of the forward-looking people among us, sort of looking around corners to see what might be coming down the road, and proceeded. They were put together.
Before there were the health plans, money was a fairly severe barrier to some people.
Some it was, but remember at that time, this was before the great technological revolutions that came along. We didn't have MRIs. We did well to be able to get throat culture and a CBC and an X-ray. So we didn't have the massive amount of tech things that have subsequently become available.
And throughout your practice, how do you feel access to care has changed? When you started, do you think people who needed care got it?
No, as I indicated, people would oftentimes wait until they had a desperate situation, oftentimes resulting in hospitalization, which, if had been taken care of earlier, would have been necessary.
And then, do you think it has continuously improved?
Mm-hmm, I do. Look at the number of hospital beds that we've been able to close, and look at what is in hospitals in terms of every hospital bed is practically an intensive care unit these days. You don't see very many people in the hospital with measles, which was fairly common. We now see, if we see someone who is moderately dehydrated, they can be taken care of in an office oftentimes with intravenous fluids. So all those things I think have contributed toward better health.
So you would see the closing of hospitals around Worcester basically as an indication of the improved health of the population.
Now, is that a bit of a jump? I'm not sure. I'd have to think of that a little bit in terms of are those two things related in that way? I'm not sure. I'm not going to answer that right off.
Okay.
I'll think about it a bit.
Wasn't something I'd written down. It just occurred to me.
What do you think? What do you think? What would you think?
I think, I'm sure it has to do with many factors, but I would think that to some extent, hospitals didn't need to be used as much as office technology. And therefore, there wasn't need for as many beds.
Yeah. You remember, for example, that the stone that's being thrown at those who practice managed care, that they profit by withholding care. Also remember that during the predominantly fee-for-service days, giving more care was conducive to a better income. Hysterectomies, for example. I think we're still looking at that as a problem. So, are you aware of the curve that plots results of care against amount of care? Well, let me do it backwards if I can. Here is the result of care. Okay. Here is the amount of care. Here is the amount of care going up, and at the same time the result of care going up, and then you get to a point where starts to drop off, so that more care at a given point becomes counterproductive. And one is likely to see that particularly in physicians' families. A physician goes to a colleague, also a friend, and said, would you take care of things here for me? I have a sick child. The physician who is called upon by his friend to do that probably will go beyond what he would normally have done in a non-physician patient. And that oftentimes can result in some disasters. So just watch that when you get care and when you give care.
Yeah, that's definitely good to know. Going back to how the science of medicine has changed, and you mentioned that clearly there's been amazing improvements in infectious disease. Sort of in the later 50s and 60s, what were the major diseases that you would see?
This was before measles vaccine, of course. Polio, the last great polio epidemics occurred in 1955 and 1956, and we're still seeing people, some now with the post-polio syndrome, as well as those who had significant loss of anterior horn cell. Anterior horn cell, am I right? Anterior horn cell is the cell that's attacked in polio. Do I remember my anatomy line? No?
No idea.
No? Okay. All right.
Next year.
Okay. All right. The polio was a major problem at that time, and it was only after the polio vaccine was announced by the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, now known as the Match of Dimes, on April 12th, 1955. Now, why did they choose that date, you suppose? It's the 10th anniversary of the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who died on April 12th, 1945. And he, of course, was a polio victim, as you know, and his law partner went on to develop the Match of Dimes and support the SOC. I've heard, and I cannot substantiate this, but I've heard it rumored, that the vaccine, which was, as you know, a kill vaccine given by injection, was rushed a little bit into production in order to meet that deadline of being able to announce it on the 12th of April, 1955. And as you also know, there were several instances of polio, of vaccine-induced polio at the time, just as there are still occasionally occurring something with the SOC, with the Sabin vaccine because of the escape of some vaccine into the gastrointestinal tract of unimmunized individuals.
Were you involved at all in the massive immunization that happened in Worcester?
Sure, yeah. In fact, somewhere there's a picture of me on the front page of the Worcester Telegram giving vaccine. It was given through the schools at that time to specific ages. I forget what the ages are. I think probably the first 4 or 5 grades. It was then, after the immunization we carried out, then it was available to us to get in our offices. So I was, didn't stick myself once.
What do you think the most important breakthrough in terms of curing disease has been?
Probably antibiotics. Secondly, and this is not necessarily an order of importance, the focus on preventive medicine, which is still a long way to go, but certainly is making tremendous strides. And thirdly, the increased diagnostic ability. And finally, the character and intellectual ability of young people coming into medicine. Don't disappoint me. No, I think tremendous, really. I admire your abilities, and as struggle as I am, as you might imagine, trying to keep up with the variety of antibiotics that are present, pouring through the New England Journal every week to make sure I don't miss anything, so forth. And we'll come to it.
You mentioned that you felt preventive medicine had still a ways to go. What steps, additional steps do you think could be taken or need to be done?
I think extending access to care. Of course, I'm interested primarily in children. I think in a sense, it is more of a social problem than it is a public health problem. And I think the major problem that I think your generation is going to face is the increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots. And I think this is true in medicine, among physicians even true. And I think the concentration of wealth in that top 5% of the population to the detriment of the bottom third is terrible, and it's got to be addressed, and I hope it will be.
How do you feel physicians are handling educating their patients and giving them all the options that they have?
I think they're still by and large wrapped up in curing disease. Yeah, I don't think there's much. It's not as intellectually challenging. It's fine. You sit down and talk with someone. Don't smoke. Why do you smoke? How can I help you stop smoking? Look at your weight. That sort of thing, I think, is not. It doesn't turn most physicians on.
When do you think the idea that preventing disease is equally, if not more so important than curing disease? When did that first start coming into discussion, and how has that changed?
Oh, I suppose it began with the introduction of smallpox vaccine. How long ago was that?
Smallpox is the late 40s. So it was invented, and then they eradicated it in 70 something?
When was the vaccine first made available?
No idea.
1790.
Oh, okay.
The oldest vaccine available. William Jenner, I think it was Jenner, noticed that the dairy maids would have a mild form of so-called cowpox, and that then when there would be an epidemic of smallpox, they would be immune. And he developed a system whereby he would inoculate people with serum from the cowpox vesicles, and that was really the first vaccine. Most people don't know it's that old, but it took us 200 years to do anything about it in terms of the world, whereas probably we have, I don't think there's anything else that is close to eradication, third world, so forth. So that I think that's where a great deal of the effort has to come. Just to go.
Specifically about diseases such as tuberculosis, did you see that much?
Not a great deal. Not a great deal. We were at that time, and up until say 10 years ago, tuberculin testing was still was used extensively. That was one of the things one did annually, and most of the time, when one would find a child with a positive tuberculin test, it would lead one to the discovery of a source of infection, usually in a family member, a grandparent, parent, household visitor, something like that.
I know that at one point physicians believed that too was a disease that would completely go away. but hasn't instead just come back.
With renewed vigor. Yes, yeah, that's a...
Are there other examples of that sort of thing happening? Where a disease has been under control and now is sort of creeping up on us again?
I'm afraid we might be seeing a little bit of that. I can't say that I can quote chapter and verse, but I think we've become somewhat more casual in our treatment of streptococcal disease. It's a long time since I've seen anyone with cardiac disease following a strep infection or renal disease following a strep infection. But I think unless we are militant in terms of diagnosing strep and treating it effectively, then we may well see something like that.
What was your medical service like in Tokyo?
It was an interesting activity because I was at the main hospital, the Tokyo Army Hospital, which was the hospital for the Far East Command. And we not only took care of the soldiers, but we also took care of the diplomatic corps and many of the foreign traders. We also took care of the Russians. In fact, this was during the Korean War. We had some very good friends among the Russians, despite the fact that their minions in North Korea were beating on us. But it was an interesting experience.
And you were in Tokyo taking care of troops that were in the Korean War?
By and large, we were taking care of those who were stationed in Tokyo, but it was also a staging area for evacuation from Korea. As you remember, having seen MASH, have you seen MASH? I'm sure that was an innovation of the Korean War. That these mobile army surgical units were right up front, so that there was a great deal of work being done. They didn't have to wait to be evacuated to Tokyo. We did see the more severe problems. We had a large neurosurgical ward. We had a large orthopedic service, and we had a large pediatric service too. Not as a result of casualties of the Korean War, but from the dependents who were in Tokyo at the time.
Coming from Tokyo back to America, was there any sort of culture shock?
Well, because we lived really in a I guess isolation would be the word. My wife and I had quarters in what had been formerly the Japanese Pentagon in Tokyo. It was the Ministry of War, and most of our social life was with the people. We did have good friends among the foreign traders, and as a matter of fact, I was involved in teaching English as a second language to some students at Keio University during the time we were there, so that we were able to meet many people in that way.
Did you ever go back to visit?
Yes, we did. Couldn't find our way around. It had changed so much. So that,
was it common for physicians graduating when you did to go into Army service immediately following residency?
It was not common. I had gone into military service because I was finishing my residency at a time when the world seemed to be in a little bit of turmoil, and I thought that rather than going into practice, getting a practice established, and then having something fall apart, I would volunteer to spend 2 years in the Army. As it happened, a great many of my classmates medical school passed through Tokyo. In fact, my wife and I were running a sort of R&R on our own with people who were coming through. Because I'd gone in early, I was assigned to Tokyo, and happy enough, fortunate enough to be able to do pediatrics. As it happened, I didn't get out as quickly as I thought I would. I spent 3 years instead of 2, but it was an interesting thing. The reason I did that is because we were married on the Saturday, the 20th of June, and as you recall, perhaps, the Korean invasion from North Korea started on Sunday, the 25th of June. So that we had already been assigned to the Tokyo Army Hospital, and were planning to cross the country and cross the Pacific together. And I was called up early and left my wife of 3 weeks behind me, and she didn't catch up with me for another 18 months. But I stayed on longer because at a given point in time, one could either choose to spend 6 months and then go home, or if one wanted to bring one's spouse over, she could come then, but you'd be committed to another year. And we chose to begin our marriage all over again and not wait for that 6. So you could edit that out, but don't bother with that. Okay.
What was medical school like for you?
Medical school was great. We had a fine time. It was during the war. It was made a great many good friends. Most of us at the time that we started medical school at that time had limited college experiences. In fact, there were in my entering class in medical school a handful of students, and these were all male at the time, who were only 17 when they began medical school. They had something. First of all, they were a bright group, with certain exceptions, of young men, and they had probably had double promotions as they went through grammar school and high school, and had admitted to college early on, and then had 18 months of college before going to medical school. So we made some very good friends, and I had been the class agent for my class, and have been regarded as prodding them gently to make contributions to the medical school with some success. So that we had great reunions, and it's been a great experience.
Was medical school 4 years?
Yes, it was. In fact, it was even longer than the number of calendar months because the war ended when we were in our 3rd year. So we had started in January 1944, and went right through until the summer of 1946, then had 2 months off, and then wanted to graduate in June of 47. So the actual number of months was longer than the usual 12 times 4, 48 months.
When in medical school did you first start seeing patients?
Laying hands on,
Yeah.
sometime during the 1st year.
Mm.
Yep, under close supervision, but started taking histories. But we missed having, and I hope you have the experience, is having patient impersonators. There's another term for impersonators. Doesn't sound very good. Patient.
Standardized patients.
What do you call them?
Standardized patients. Standardized patients.
Standardized patients. Yeah, people who take on the attributes and act it out for you. Have you done that? Yeah. My wife did that too here, but she hasn't done it recently. So.
How do you feel medical education has changed since the time you were in medical school and currently?
Well, interesting. I have probably had more exposure to 2 schools since I graduated, one Harvard, of course, but my son went to Hopkins, and it was interesting to see the difference between his education at Hopkins was very similar to mine in terms of my experience 40, 50, 60 years ago versus what is happening now at Harvard anyway in terms of what the experience is. I think it's, I'm not sure whether it's better or worse, certainly different.
What do you think it's important for students to know now that probably students didn't have to learn when you were in medical school?
I think you will be dealing with a much better educated group of patients. I think you will have to learn to take their views into much more consideration than we ever did. I always tell the story about a time when my mother was visiting my family in Worcester, and we went to church with her, and as we were coming out of church, one of my most devoted patients came over to her and said, "Mrs. Duggan, if your son told me to go over and jump off the bridge over Lake Quinsigamon, I would do so." My mother's response was to say, "What's the matter with that woman?" But I think that was the sort of thing that one found, that the patients accepted what the doctor said, right or wrong. And I think now it's much healthier that the patient can ask questions. I do think that one of the difficult aspects of this is the current advertising campaign which the drug companies are putting on in terms of ask your doctor about this expensive medication not proven to be any better than something you get over the counter at CVS. And I think that's I think patients need to be better informed about what's going on there. And I think many of them are not being fooled by this pandering.
You mentioned that feel patients are much more educated nowadays. How do you feel patients view physicians? Do they respect them as much as they did in the past?
If by physicians you mean my doctor, yes. If by physicians as a whole, no. Sure. I think the individual physician, as he relates to his patients, is still admired and regarded with affection, as a matter of fact. So.
What did you feel like your role in the Worcester community was when you moved here, being a physician? Did that give you any specific place in the community?
In terms of community involvement, it really centered around one's activity as a physician. For example, I was a school physician for many years, and the medical society is, as you know, a significant group. I had served as counselor to the Mass Medical Society, and I also supported candidates for public office, visibly supported them, going so far at one time as to carry a sign on the top of my car, for which I was roundly criticized because at that time physicians were not supposed to be anything but neutral. I did support particularly some of my colleagues who ran for office, particularly for the school committee, which I thought was, and I'm a letter writer. I'm composing one right now to Bob Lobel to ask him to get together with the sports writers, sports TV people in Boston and stop showing these scenes of violence in the baseball field and the hockey ring and the basketball court. Because I think it's a deleterious effect upon the minds and actions of particularly young men and to some extent some young women. And I think that he could play a leading role in doing that. I'm going to tell him so when I get around to doing it.
That's a good idea.
That's excellent. I wanted to find out a little bit about how finances for physicians have changed. For example, when you were in medical school, was it a very expensive proposition?
Tuition at the time was Harvard Medical School was the least expensive of the three schools in Boston. It was $500 a year.
And compared to, let's say, a year's salary, what was that?
I had no idea what physicians were running on. I didn't find out until I came to Worcester and asked one of my local mentors what could I expect, and he gave me a conservative figure, which turned out to be quite accurate.
Do you think cost was an issue for anybody entering medical school?
Do I think that?
That cost was an issue in terms of anybody who wanted to enter medical school?
Not the way it is, not to the extent it is now. So.
And given
It was. Let me put a little parentheses here. I think one of the great things that happened during World War II and after World War II was that as a result of the V-8, naval V-8 programs and ASTP programs, and as a result following the war of the GI Bill, a great many people who probably would not have been able to go to medical school. I don't know whether I would have been able to or not. I suspect I was thick-headed enough to say I'll find the money somewhere. In fact, I borrowed money to go to college, and I'm sure I would have done the same thing with medical school, maybe even dropping out to work for a year or so. At that time, it was not common for medical students to be married. You married? No? How many of your class are half of them perhaps married?
Quite a few.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I was in medical school, there were probably 2 or 3, and of course that was the 2 aspects of that. First of all, if you had a wife who had a profession or job, she could support you through medical school. And secondly, if you weren't married, it wasn't so expensive to live anyway. So that, since the one happens than the other, I guess. No, I think it's still a major problem, and that's one of the reasons I work as I do to collect money from my classmates, most of whom, like me, went through medical school at government expense and ought to be giving. And they do. They do. For our 50th reunion, we raised $500,000 among 100 people for a scholarship in honor of our deceased classmates.
Yeah, I think one of the main worries right now is that because it is so expensive for students to be going to medical school, that their choices when they graduate are much more limited as to what they think they can go into. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's only money. Do what you want to do. Don't worry about paying it back. You'll get to it. So that's
yeah. That's an important thing to know.
But don't just go into anesthesiology or radiology or plastic surgery, because you'll be able to get the debt off your back sooner. That's one of the glories of this school. Terrific. That you can. You're both from Massachusetts.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's why this school is just so amazing. I'm sure the money factored at least into my decision that if I went here, I felt like, I can do anything afterwards.
Every time you think of that, remember the Democratic Party was responsible for this. Okay?
You have to make my classmates much more aware of that.
Oh, Governor Dever really was, and his chief secretary, Judge I forgot his name, but he was in fact supported by the governor. And I think you'd find that Senator Belger, the president, would have the same thoughts. So vote Democratic. Okay.
I think it works somewhat in the opposite way, too, as opposed to specializing to make more money to pay back to you guys. I think a lot of people now are feeling that they don't want to keep specializing because they'll be in training for longer periods of time and not making as much money.
Yep.
And therefore it limits them in that sense. If they
Good. That's a good. The other thing to remember is that, I'm you can guess how old I am. We graduated from medical school in 1947. I can still do things. Plastic surgeon can't. Not many radiologists do, though we do have at the clinic a radiologist, a woman, who just celebrated her 80th birthday, and if she hadn't just had her hip replaced, she'd be out there reading films and as sharp as can be. But that's unusual. Surgeons don't last that long. A stressful life. So that I think it would interrupt. But it's only money. I know it's easy for me to say it's only money at my point, but bear that in mind. If that's the major problem you have, money, you'll be well off. Any of the parents and relatives that go to medical school?
No. In fact, I'm the first person, I think, in both sides of my extended family to go to medical school. But we certainly had family friends.
What made you decide?
Well, I thought I wanted to go into laboratory science. And then started working on HIV and was working with a doctor who was testing a bunch of HIV drugs. I just realized...
Where?
This was down at Roger Williams Hospital.
Oh, okay. The reason I ask is that my daughter-in-law, who is a physician, has been working at Dana-Farber on a similar kind of project. So.
But I think I just realized that in order to actually get the drugs and the vaccines and the science from the bench to the patient, you really need to be the person who can work with the patient.
Right. Yep. That's always a gap. Laboratory people are not always tuned into patients. How about you?
I have relatives, some in the medical field, most of my immediate family is either dentist or orthodontist. My uncle graduated from Tufts Medical School in 1990. So,
where's home?
Leominster, Massachusetts.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Where's your home, Law?
I'm from Lexington.
Oh, okay.
I found that this school, I think, has a much more of a community atmosphere than my friends who are going to other medical schools. And my thought on that is that it's because we are more focused on general practice, on community medicine. Do you have any experience with schools that more focus on specialties, and do you think that they're different from a school that focuses more on community?
What evidence do you have that the focus is on community medicine? Why do you say that?
The reason I would say that is because throughout our first and second years, we're paired up with a doctor that we follow around once a week who is a general practitioner of some sort. That I think about half the people graduating from here go into generalist residencies, general medicine residencies.
Family practice, or do you include in that internal medicine and pediatrics?
Yeah.
Family practice, internal medicine, pediatrics.
Yeah, so the three primary care, yeah. I had at one time when early in medical school, I thought that I wanted to do what was then called general practice, and it didn't take me very long to find out that I really didn't think I could encompass skills to do a general practice with internal medicine and pediatrics. That was one of the other reasons I focused on pediatrics. I think it's more manageable, and I haven't been enthused about family practice as a direction. I think the traditional internal medicine and pediatrics, or maybe even some of the double majors, internal medicine and pediatrics together, I think offers quite a challenge. But that's one man's opinion.
How has malpractice and, I guess, just how it's arisen there in the 70s or 80s, how has that affected the way physicians practice?
I think it's been greatly exaggerated in terms of the impact it has had. First of all, the great majority of physicians have never been sued. Secondly, the great majority of those who have been sued have been found innocent or have not been punished in any way. So I think the malpractice premiums are high, much higher than they were, certainly. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we have in Massachusetts more lawyers than we have in all of Japan. So I think there's a surfeit of people out there looking for something to do. And we're easy targets.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we bring it on ourselves most of the time by what we say and what we do or don't do. So.
What do you suppose physicians can do to prevent that?
I think be candid with their patients, keep good records, never criticize a colleague, because you do not know what's going on in someone else's office.
Do you think that physicians work together with colleagues more or less than they used to?
Much more, yeah. I did solo practice for, 4 or 5 years. I brought in a partner, and that was a very good thing to do. And then both of us joined the Fallon Clinic and founded the pediatric department over there. So that, as I tell my colleagues over there, that was the beginning of the movement for when we joined. No one listens.
Are you still practicing over there?
I'm very limited. I primarily am taking care of some boys at Nazareth Home, which is a residential treatment center in Leicester. And I'm doing some college health at Holy Cross and Clark and WPI. And I also, and this goes back to telling you to get involved, I'm also doing appeals for United Healthcare patients who have been denied something or other, usually a child. Material is sent to me and I adjudicate whether they have a case or not. And it's about 50-50 that they do. Others are just milking the system.
Right. Coming back to what Worcester is like now, which is when you first moved here,
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about how that has changed?
Oh, I think it's become a much more diverse community. When I first started practice, Great Brook Valley, for example, was a community where many of the interns and residents in training at that time lived. One could go almost anywhere in Worcester at that time without any concern. And I think, again, this is a fallout from the separation of of the haves from the have-nots, that one has to be rather careful about where one goes. I think we have a large Hispanic community, as you know. Black community in Worcester when I first arrived was only about 5%. And that apparently had come about because the great manufacturers, the Nortons, the Wyman Gordons, usually did not hire very many black people. Mostly, I've been told, because of the level of skill required for their businesses.
Do you think that the diversity now has divided the community?
No, I don't think so. I think that we're probably about to have the first Hispanic member of the city council. We just had the first black woman, black person on the city council, who's about to go on another job, and she's being replaced by the Hispanic who was followed her in the election. We have an unusually good school system here too, which I think has tremendously improved over the years. The model in many ways.
How do you think physicians can prepare themselves to treat a very diverse community?
Try to learn a little bit about some of the cultural aspects of the community. Treating Hispanics, for example. Almost always, when the Hispanics come to the office, they are accompanied by the male in the family. And he is the one who makes the decisions. And oftentimes you make recommendations and make sure that you give him opportunity to have input. Mm-hmm. God knows what happens when she gets him home, but at least outside the home, he is the dominant person. Mm-hmm. I think that's just an example. I think it's helpful to pick up a few Spanish words. You can opera la boca and that sort of thing. So you can at least indicate that you appreciate that there is a bar sometimes to treatment. Recognize that you have to deal sometimes. Southeast Asians, for example, have some unusual treatment modalities, and I think one has to be aware that that might be going on while you're trying to treat a strep throat with penicillin. They may be trying to treat it with something from the swamp, for all we know. So I think you try to make sure you know about that. Oftentimes, a good nurse is very helpful in terms of drawing that out. She's less of an authoritarian figure, and this can be very good. My partner and I brought the first pediatric nurse practitioner to the city by having her sent down to which was a training period went on at Children's Hospital at that time, so she's still with us.
What was it like for female physicians when you first started practicing?
There weren't many. There weren't many. Dr. Jane Fitzpatrick, so if you see that video,
yep.
You know her?
Yeah.
Sure. Where'd you see her?
I've not ever met her in person. But I know the words in her name.
Yes,
Dr. Wheeler and Dr. McGee talk about her all the time.
Yeah.
Read about her in the District Medical Society's book.
Yep. Okay, very good. She was one of the few in pediatrics. The only pediatric. There was a woman who was a dermatologist, and that was about it. So there just weren't very many.
Were they well respected by the community?
Yes, very much so. Oh yeah, yes, very much so.
When did you first notice that started to really change in terms of the number of women physicians? Well, maybe when we brought on when there were two of us practicing pediatrics, and we brought on a woman to practice with us. Mm-hmm. So that was a breakthrough. Yeah.
In terms of.
What contributed to that decision?
We looked over the field, and she was the most qualified.
How did your patients react to that?
They reacted as they did to the nurse practitioner. We found that oftentimes someone would call up, someone who had been a patient of mine for many years, and would say, "Would rather see Dr. Ruth, or would rather see the nurse practitioner." And you have to stop for a minute and say, "Well, I brought it on myself." So that was great to see something like that happen. It means your judgment was corroborated in terms of the quality of the people that you recruited.
What did you like best about Worcester?
What I like best about Worcester? Oh my goodness. I like the size of the community. I like being able to go just about anywhere in Worcester in 5 or 10 minutes. So that the physical geography, I think, is very good. In the common parlance, it's been a great place to have raised a family. Everyone says that about every place, I guess. But it's like the person who said that he went to the. This was a graduate of Yale Medical School who said to someone, "I went to the best medical school in the world." He said, "How do you know? It's the only one you went to." Well, it's the only city I've lived in, so I really have much of a basis for a comparison. I think I love the cultural aspects of it, the Worcester Art Museum, Mechanics Hall, all those things that are very good. And I love having a medical school here.
Well, thanks very much for doing the interview.
You're very welcome. Edited it very carefully. Okay?